Welcome, everyone. My name is Harold Trinkunas. I'm the Deputy Director here at CSAC. Welcome to our research seminar. Very much looking forward to a talk by Professor Catherine Stoner entitled Russia Resurrected, Power and Purpose in a New Global Order. Dr. Stoner is also the Deputy Director of the Friedman Swogli Institute, a Senior Fellow here at the Institute associated with both CSAC, our center, and with Center for Democracy Development and the Rule of Law.
Just that other one, right?
Yes, yes. She has been at Stanford since 2004. Prior to that, she was at Princeton, author or co-author of at least 5 books, and she's here to talk to us about her 6th. And she received her PhD in government from Harvard University. So welcome, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Great, thanks. So I just got the cover, so I'm quite excited about that. And a couple of you in the back saw it earlier this week, so sorry, Chip and David and John on that. But, you know, give me your feedback after you've heard my talk on it. Condi Rice, I showed it to her earlier this week as well, and she thought it evoked some socialist realism here, you know, which I kind of thought was a nice touch on the part of Oxford. So Harold just pointed out that I should update my bio because apparently it says this book is forthcoming in 2017. So some stuff happened, and for me, and also for Russia, and it took a little longer, and it got a little bigger. So I'm going to try and, I wrestled with how to present this, whether to present just shine the flashlight on a little bit of the elephant, or whether to try and describe the whole elephant imperfectly. And unfortunately for you, I've gone with describe the whole elephant imperfectly. But I'd be very happy to go into any of the details more. And it's about a 500-page manuscript, so I'm necessarily going to be condensing it. Perhaps not enough for some, though, I will say. So I should say that the impetus for this book actually came from this table right here, this seat. And it was when Michael Hayden, the former General Michael Hayden, former Director of National Intelligence, came here and gave a talk about the new global order and how Russia, this was probably about 5 years ago, how Russia and North Korea were at the little table, and they want to be at the big table of power, but you know, they just don't have the means to do that. And essentially, this is something I had heard a number of times, and I thought, you know, that was an interesting observation, but I don't think North Korea and Russia are the same at all. And it made me start thinking about how we think about power and whether Russia is a strong state or a weak state. And honestly, when I began, I expected to find that Russia was a weak state. Not just in domestic terms, in being able to implement policy, but also in international terms. If you just simply tally up what Russia has relative to other countries, then someone like Michael Hayden is absolutely right. It's got you know, just 3.14% of the global economy, and it doesn't look anything like China. But, and this would lead you to dismiss it in the international community as being significant or a threat. But Russia had begun to flex its muscles internationally. And what I find remarkable about this is that, of course, it's just a little over 25 years since the complete collapse of the Soviet Union, which was the biggest economic disaster, man-made economic disaster outside of war, except for Venezuela now, which is certainly giving it a run for its money. Let's see, what's happening here? This is not advancing. Wait, here we go. Okay, so these are the questions that inform the book, and circulate, I think, on the website is a chapter. And each of the chapters begins with a quote from Putin, which perhaps puts too much emphasis on Putin himself, but nonetheless, this is the way it is so far. And he makes this statement relatively early in his first administration. Russia was never so strong as it wants to be and never so weak as it is thought to be. And here he's paraphrasing Churchill, who's paraphrasing somebody else. So the question of the book really is Russia resurrected as a strong state? It's sometimes referred to as the Phoenix state because this wouldn't be Russia's first resurrection. It came back after 1917, and we could go back into the 19th century, the 17th century, and so on, and it seems to be rising up again. Also, is Russia a great power, or can it merely be a good enough power? Does it matter if it doesn't have parity in all of the means of power as a realist might think about it? It can evidently be good enough to be very, very disruptive. Why and how this has happened is another main question of the book, and what its evident resurrection as an influencer in international politics can actually tell us about how we think about power in the 21st century. This thing keeps echoing. You notice it too, I guess. Mm-hmm. Right, anyway, it's a little distracting. So again, here is Putin. There's a noticeable, I would say, resurgence in Russia's foreign policy, global foreign policy, after about 2007, but really after 2012 when Putin comes back into power. This is, I think, when we can sort of mark Russian revanchism, if you will. So the argument of the book is basically, in 2007, he makes this speech in Munich that's very aggressive toward and complaining about the Cold War settlement. He comes back into power in 2012 as president of Russia after Dmitry Medvedev's interlude between 2008 and 2012. And here we start seeing a real change in foreign policy, but I should also note in domestic policy too. There are crackdowns on non-governmental organizations. They are required to register as foreign agents if they receive money from abroad. There's increased bullying of neighbors. Even before 2012, cyber attack in Estonia, Georgian War of 2008, and then ultimately we get 2014 Crimea, seizure, and Donbass. Barack Obama, of course, has said that Russia is, rather infamously said, in 2014, Russia's a regional power, and it is bullying its neighbors. But beyond that, we really don't have to worry about it. Here's the exact quote. "It is threatening some of its immediate neighbors, not out of strength, but out of weakness." And so in the second chapter of the book, I document that, how it has done this since 2012. In particular, though, I say that Russia has become far more than merely a hegemon within its immediate neighborhood. And so the book paints out how Russia has also moved beyond its immediate neighborhood into farther into Eastern Europe, become disruptive in Western Europe, and has made new partnerships in the Middle East, resuscitated old partnerships, and then has gradually moved in to helping Venezuela, for example, stay afloat, and also into sub-Saharan Africa, most recently a few weeks ago, forgiving billions of dollars in Soviet-era debt in return for contracts. So one of the arguments is it's not the best power. It's not the, in a traditional means way of measuring power, but it is a good enough power to be disruptive, especially at a time when American foreign policy is one of retreat globally. So again, beyond its immediate neighborhood, we also get flyovers of Russian military planes throughout Europe without flight plans, buzzing over aircraft carriers. And I think a real turning point for Russia in terms of its global influence was this surprise deployment in Syria in 2015. Surprise in a number of ways. One, in that they had the audacity to do it, and two, that they did it so quickly. And so even members of our own military have indicated that was something they didn't realize Russia had the capability of doing. Putin has been quite thrilled with talking about his nuclear weapons and his strategic nuclear weapons in particular. There's an apparent, I got a little bold here, apparent abandonment of a no first use policy. And the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has said we're now 3 minutes to midnight. Military doctrines, successive military doctrines, 2014, 2016 identify NATO as the biggest threat to Russian security. We in turn have identified Russia as an existential threat to the United States, along with China. So again, the shocking thing is how quickly this has happened. These claims that Russia is rewriting the Cold War settlement with force. But this is really only just more than 25 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So how can it be that it is capable of this if, as General Hayden said, it is really at the little table? And maybe we're not thinking about power the right way. Maybe he was wrong. I think he was wrong. And maybe power in the 21st century in the international system is exercised or best measured not just by men, military, and money, but looking beyond this. So the book goes into taking on people like actually John Mearsheimer, who has had this sort of peculiar argument that is right out of the Kremlin playbook about Russia under Putin is just doing what a great power would do. So this is an argument basically that it doesn't matter who the president of Russia is. Russia has interests, and Mr. Putin is simply picking up those interests and now pursuing them geostrategically. So I disagree with that. I don't think it's as simple as that. It's not just about structure of the international system. I don't think Russia being an enemy of the West is inevitable, and I don't think Russia's actions are merely reactive. And I want to keep saying Russia under Putin. Oh, we're getting some update information. Okay, I want to say Russia under Putin. Michael McFall always says there's no Mr. Russia, and that's true. But in this case, there's kind of a Mr. Russia in this story anyway. And because I do think a different leader would behave differently. And so in the book, I make this argument that, in fact, different leaders have behaved differently towards the West and in the international system. And so the book goes a little bit into Gorbachev, goes into Yeltsin, into early Putin, when he's actually quite interested in interacting positively with us here in the West. It's always cited that he's among the first, perhaps the first, to call George Bush after 9/11 and express his condolences. And as Angela Stent says in her book, looks forward to negotiating or to working against Islamic terrorism together. He's disappointed in this. And so some would argue that's it. He takes his toys and decides he's going to go play somewhere else. Medvedev, though, is also cooperative between 2008 and 2012. And so the chapter that I gave to you guys, if you got it, talks really about this reset period where there's a lot of cooperation between Russia and Europe and the United States and even NATO. But after 2012, something changed with Vladimir Putin. And so the book goes through explaining what it is toward the end of the book. But to argue that this is a great power doing what any leader would do, I think is flawed by the empirics. So again, Resurrected, question mark. And I should say that I wanted the book to be called Resurrected. And Oxford took the question mark out and said, it's Resurrected. We have to be bold here. So it depends on relative to what, right? Certainly relative to where we were December 25th, 1991, when the Soviet Union collapses and Gorbachev is tugged out of his office in the Kremlin. I think some people say you can still see the nail marks on the wall because he didn't want to leave. But in January of 1992, they embark on very ambitious, ultimately very mixed economic reforms, some think disastrous. But we are giving food aid to Russia in the early 1990s. I myself bought some frozen chicken on the streets as a graduate student from USAID because I guess it had been stolen and it was being sold on the black market. Russia was receiving food aid from us, from Europe. It was receiving technical aid in trying to set up a constitution and electoral system. It was getting IMF loans in billions of dollars. And as I mentioned, it's the worst economic catastrophe outside of wartime, except now for Venezuela. Kind of not the award you want to be getting, but some quick facts just to remind you, Russia's not easy to govern. That's pretty small font. Russia's not easy to govern, and this has historically always been a problem. So to be able to get up off its knees from where it came from, given its geography, is pretty impressive as well, I think. And we shouldn't underestimate that, the resiliency of Russia. So it's the largest country in the world geographically, has 14 international borders, 11 time zones. What it does affects a lot of other people. It only has 146.5 million people. I'm counting the 2.5 that Vladimir Putin always counts in the annexation of Crimea. That's a little controversial, so you could say it has 144 million people. It had negative population growth until the last 2 or 3 years, and now we can say it's flat, but not positive yet. There is a chapter in the book that's on society and talks a little bit about demographics. Demographics are challenging. It also talks about brain drain and how there actually is net in-migration to Russia, but the immigrants that are coming in are not, no, it's okay, are not as highly educated as those leaving. So this presumably is not good long-term for the economy. The GDP per capita at purchasing power parity in 2015 adjusted dollars was in, this is 2017 because I wanted to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the collapse or the start of reforms, was $24,451. So I just wanted to compare, that it's less than half of what the US is, but this is 25 years after GDP per capita was like $100 or $1,000. So this is pretty remarkable growth. We focus a lot on China, which is even more remarkable growth, but this isn't nothing is all I'm trying to say. Its GDP is only 3.82 trillion versus the US, which is almost 19.5 trillion. It's not exactly an economic powerhouse, but it recovered reasonably well. Standards of living are reasonably good. And I think one obviously should seriously question anybody who says it's a shambles, it's a mess. Whether it's sustainable, we'll get to, but it's not terrible. So this is getting to power and the measurement of power. So as I said, there's an argument in the book against the way that realists traditionally measure power. And I pick on Mearsheimer a bit because he's parroting the line largely of the Kremlin. And we should look beyond just men, military, and money. That is the health and wealth of the population, the size of the military, the number of weapons it has, and the kinds of weapons it has, and money, the economy. So, we can quickly concede that the Russian economy is nowhere near the size of the American economy. In a moment, I'll show you that it's nowhere near the size, obviously, of the Chinese economy or the EU 28 either. Fine. But somehow it has reinserted itself into the international system such that we have heads of our Joint Chiefs of Staff saying it is an existential threat to the United States. So either it's not, or they're thinking of power in some way other than just this realist way. So I use this multidimensional approach, which is not my own. That comes out of the work of Jim Baldwin. I talk about a geographic dimension. First of all, I'll tell you what I think, how I define power, which, let's see, I found a nice quote that's in here from Joe Nye, which is, it's like love, it's hard to describe, but we all know what we mean. Oh, here it is, this is good. Power is like love, easier to experience than to define or measure, but it's no less real for that. I would say amen. That's Joe Nye. In a 2016 survey of about 1,600 Russian adults over the age of 16 by the Levada Center, which is a respected and real polling center, 65% of respondents indicated that Russia is definitely yes or probably yes to the question, do you think Russia is a great power? So those respondents obviously have something in their minds. I just showed you what the economy looked like, right? So that implies a commonly accepted metric of power, and there isn't really a commonly accepted metric of power. So one of the goals of the book is to undertake a thorough analysis of available data and to meaningfully assess changes in Russian global influence since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and then look at a more nuanced conceptualization of power in foreign policy. So I seek really to answer the question of whether Russia's resurrection is real or merely imagined, and how we can tell and why it might matter. So I use this definition of power in a multidimensional approach. It's really power over what or whom and power to do what. So rather than just a strict tally, a power asset, I think we have to remember in one situation may be a liability in another. And Baldwin also notes that it is difficult to say a country is strong or weak unless you know what game is being played. So it makes this point about what constitutes a good hand in cards without specifying whether it's bridge or poker is not helpful. I don't play bridge, but I know it's not the same as poker. So the different dimensions of power that I use are policy scope, geographic domain, and then the traditional means of power, men, military, and money. So across what issues is an actor important? So here we can start to differentiate between North Korea and, let's say, Russia, right? Across how weighty is an actor in a particular policy area? The greater number and importance of issues of B's activity that's affected by A, then the more powerful is A over B. Domain of power, how many actors are subject to the A's influence, and how many B's are there relative to A. So the domain of power recognizes that a state may just be a regional power, right? But has little or no influence in other parts of the world. So part of the book, as I mentioned, chapter 2 actually goes through the regional approach and where Russia is, what kinds of levers and what policy areas and through what means Russia is able to influence countries in the immediate region. So no surprise, it's a regional hegemon. But in the third chapter, I then go and look and see where else is Russia powerful, looking in other parts of the world. So here we look in Europe, in the Middle East, into North and Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia, and in what policy areas, in Latin America, and through what means. So here is a crude artistic rendering that I know Oxford is going to slam all over the place already, but I just did this little Venn diagram to point out that these things overlap, and these things also can move around. They don't have to move together. And although it's represented here as all three being the same size, your policy scope could be great, but your means are small. Domain may be more limited, but these are overlapping. So I have to move sort of quickly through this. So when we think about the geographic domain of Russian power, it inherited it in part from the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire before the Soviet Union. As I said, has a high number of borders. It has moved, though, from just influencing its most immediate neighbors by doing things like cutting off gas or electricity or denial of service in Estonia, to things that are, I think, more generally known as, for example, in Western Europe, kind of trying to disrupt the consensus basis of the European Union. And it's actually dangerously effective in this, although it it can be disruptive without completely breaking up the European Union. I think the Europeans are very capable of doing that themselves. But Russia can create some disruption, right? So between old Europe and new Europe is one example. So with the Nord Stream 1 and now almost finished Nord Stream 2 pipelines into Germany, the Germans are arguing that's fine for us to do that and buy natural gas from Russia directly through these pipelines. But you, Hungary and Bulgaria, you cannot do this. And so vetoing other pipelines or deals with other parts of Europe. Other areas of influence, as I mentioned, Syria has become a real springboard for Russia internationally. And I think it was not anticipated, dare I say, a strategy so much as I think the benefit has proven to be tremendous for Russia. What have they gotten from Syria? Well, obviously changed the facts on the ground, and we helped them with that by creating a vacuum, but they've also used the Syrian conflict as an opportunity to boost the sale of arms in other parts of the Middle East and in other parts of North Africa. They've also managed to create relationships. In some cases, these are picking up old Soviet relationships, as is the Syrian relationship, but also picking up newer relationships with countries that are traditionally in opposition with one another and dealing with them each bilaterally. So with having close to a strategic relationship with Iran in terms of helping Iran extract and market possibly its oil around and getting around sanctions. Iraq actually selling weapons into northern Iraq, having combined or cooperation with Iraq on various anti-ISIS and anti-terrorism ventures, and increasing trade and signing agreements to build things like nuclear power plants in Iran, for example, and they have done the same into sub-Saharan Africa. So, you know, are these places where there's a ton of money? Is this going to turn the Russian economy around? No, but it's going to potentially keep the Russian economy afloat. One of the things that we used to say between 2000 and 2008, when the Russian economy was growing 7% year on year, well, Mr. Putin can take credit for that, but frankly, he can't take credit for global oil prices, right? Well, now, because of a relationship that he has built with Saudi Arabia, plus OPEC, they have agreed and then just renewed this agreement from 2016 to 2019, and now this agreement has been renewed from 2019 to 2021 to maintain oil prices, global oil prices, at least $80 a barrel. Now, whether they can do that, I don't know, but they have done it so far, and Saudi Arabia is traditionally our ally. In addition, they've sold Saudi Arabia S-400 missile defense systems. They've also done the same with Turkey, a member of NATO, which is highly problematic because those systems come with Russian technicians as well. And so to have the implications of having a NATO member having Russian technicians working on a different system is potentially quite problematic for Turkey's continued membership in NATO. I could go on with these examples, and I'm happy to do that in questions. The other ones that I think are known a little bit better are things like pushing this form of sort of illiberalism in Eastern Europe on very willing recipients like Viktor Orban in Hungary. But I think one of the big differences about how Russia is behaving under Putin in global politics versus the Soviet period is that it's largely aideological. They are not making, they can work easily with Saudi Arabia and Israel or Iran because they don't care what their partners do internally. They don't care about the political system. They don't particularly care about the religion. It is very pragmatic, and it is largely economic, less than it is geostrategic. So that's a big difference. They're not trying to spread communism. They don't have to build infrastructures, and they don't have to provide things for free, as in the hope that an ideology or client state will be created. These are very pragmatic, strategic relationships. Okay, so the policy scope is primarily, as I mentioned, this is simplifying things, but it's oil and gas, energy supplies and sales, helping with extraction, and also ownership or control over pipelines. So when you think about what power is in the international system, okay, you can measure it by GDP, or you can measure it by control over a really, really important resource in the global economy, which is not controlling all the oil or all the gas, but the pipelines and access to those pipelines. So northern Syria, there are big pipelines going through that area, also Iraq, also Iran. And so if you look, this is a major convergence and crossroads. So that is an extremely important new resource that they have gained access to, in particular because of the presence in Syria. Another area is non-energy trade, obviously weapons. We're number one in international weapons sales, and Russia's number two. It's kind of a distant number two, but it sells some increasingly sophisticated things, and this is partly comes from some of the energy that was put into creating, to recreating or rebooting the Russian military. Since 1917, Russia has been a net grain importer. It is now a net grain exporter. It's the biggest exporter of grain in the world. You know, again, it's not a crop that's going to make them a ton of money, but it's just some evidence that they have, you know, they have other things. I'm going to get to the weak spot right now. I'm giving you the glass is half full picture. As I mentioned, they also sell nuclear power plants, and then in places like Central African Republic, they have popped up and are very important there. And you would think, why do they care about Central African Republic? Well, it's largely because they have diamonds, and they're helping them market those diamonds and reintroduce Central African Republic into the diamond trade in particular. There are also other precious minerals throughout Southern Africa that they are making moves toward. The other thing they're doing is getting contracts in exchange for debt forgiveness, and it's Soviet-era debt forgiveness, right? So they're never going to get payment back on those debts. So here's a try at getting contracts for some of the sanctioned companies in Russia to build infrastructure in Libya, and they're trying to change the facts on the ground increasingly in Libya, as well as helping Egypt. And General Sisi gets a little bit more independence and wiggle room by using Russia juxtaposed to the United States. Here in Russia is a collaborator that does not make demands about human rights, about creating a much more open access society. Instead, they want to sell arms, they're doing it. They want to build infrastructure, they're doing it. And they want to trade as well. And then finally, in terms of the sort of third area of policy interest, there is of course a national security interest, and in trying to reassert itself as an alternate pole to the United States and Europe. Okay, so when we think about the means of power, again, this is the sort of men, military, and money. I guess I've got money, men, and military here. And so the economy, there's a chapter on the economy which sort of, you know, presents the good, bad, and the ugly of the Russian economy. It still, you know, the bad is, well, okay, there's good and there's bad. I'm going to show you the graphs in a second. Growth declined, but now it has come back up to 1.5%, not stellar. It has very significant foreign currency reserves. It has a very low debt to GDP ratio. It has low unemployment. It has low inflation. Wages are low, they're not growing, but you could argue that's the case here as well. It's obviously extremely energy revenue dependent still, but it's making gains on this. If you look at Russian society, it is, highly educated, literate population, got a lot of Russian programmers. Apparently, they're quite good at hacking. It is aging, though, and there is a brain drain, and I'll show you what the demographic pyramid looks like in a moment. And then finally, in terms of means of power, in terms of hard power, Russia has a huge nuclear arsenal still. It has modernized its military, but the U.S. military, if you just add up the numbers, we're awesome. They can't really challenge us there. But they do have these hybrid capabilities. And so in the course of researching this book, I've been surprised that our own military has been very wary of Russia's, in particular, conventional abilities. And should it choose to use those conventional abilities in, for example, parts of Eastern Europe, it would take a very, very long time for NATO to get there and, take back Estonia. I don't think that's going to happen. But their conventional capabilities, in particular their artillery and their tanks, are something that our military is looking at with some admiration. They clearly have, these hybrid capabilities, the little green men, and rapid deployment capabilities, which again, our military was surprised by seeing them in Syria. Strategic and tactical nuclear weapons, and Mr. Putin has, some of you may have seen the wonderful video of one of his State of the Federation addresses in front of Parliament, where he shows this crazy new big missile that they can send to, it looks like Mar-a-Lago in Florida, and it lands quite quickly. And then, of course, they have this new weaponry, right? And so when we think about means of power, when that literature was written by realists initially, they never thought about cyber attacks this way. And this turns out to be a low-cost and extremely effective means of disruption of energy networks and electoral systems, and also changing, as they say, the informational environment so that you doubt what reality is, what truth is. I wouldn't say this is a completely new capability. I mean, the Soviets certainly used this in different places as well. But the Russians have picked it back up, and they have cyberized it and modernized it and used it to significant effect. And again, so if you're just looking at GDP, just doesn't cost that much and can do a great deal of damage, right? So here's Russian annual growth. Russia is, where's Tiffany, one of my research assistants here. So she made this beautiful graph. So here's Russia, not looking so impressive. Look, here we are in the 90s. This is trillions of international dollars. This is just GDP, purchasing power parity. Not so impressive, especially when we compare it to China. Right? So look at that growth trajectory, pretty incredible. Russia's down here. But Mr. Putin said, hey, we want to beat Portugal by 2020. We're not going for China, we're going for Portugal. Okay, so probably not a fair comparison, because look, they started out higher than Portugal. Portugal not doing well, not exactly a standout. So he chose his comparison case well, but they really kicked Portugal around. Look at that. They are doing way better at purchasing power parity. But if we take it at GDP, again, look, here we are. Here's the United States. Here's the European Union. This is Russia. China is in orange down here. So, Russia's not a poor country. Its economy is not a shamble. Its people don't live in poverty. They live considerably better than the people of Portugal, for example. Obviously, one of the purported weaknesses, and I think it's fair enough to say, is that Russia is resource cursed, right? It is excessively dependent on oil revenue to grow. So for a long time, and Dan Treisman has a paper on this, and now I think he's kind of like just taking it off his website. And for a long time, yeah, look at that. There was really, really strong correlation between Russian GDP, which is this orange line, and global oil prices. But then it dips here, oil prices, just after 2008, and Russian GDP keeps growing, and then oil prices come back. And then oil prices dip way, way down again. But Russian GDP stays up. So that's some evidence that it's their GDP is no longer driven purely on oil revenue. There has been some diversification. I don't want to overstate it, or the health of the Russian economy, because that would be wrong. But there has been, some diversification. It's not exactly a disaster. So you can look again here at the structure of their exports. There's less reliance on energy and a little bit more reliance on things like metals and machinery, and as I mentioned, even a little bit on agriculture. But this is just in 4 years. Partly it's because the price of oil dropped, but that happened in 2014. It starts coming back, and by 2017, in comparison to 2013, 70% of exports are oil and gas. 59% by 2017. So, the trajectory is actually reasonably good on that. As I mentioned, means of influence, the energy sector, using promises of pipelines, cheap oil and gas. The result, they get Orban to oppose sanctions on Russia, but he backs off because the EU is still more important for now. But the goal is disruption, right? Soft power, again, in Serbia, pushing the Slavic Brotherhood, Orthodox Christianity, giving them old planes, which they're thrilled with. They're big posters of Putin, perhaps not surprisingly. But again, this is the immediate neighborhood. We can go outside the immediate neighborhood and see some similar things happening in places like Egypt or in Iran even, or Iraq. Means in terms of society. Society is an issue, right? Life expectancy at 68 years old is lower than Bangladesh's was in 2014. Male life expectancy, though, now is 63 years old. It was 59.9 just about 4 or 5 years ago. But in comparison, to a highly developed economy, it's quite a lot lower than the US or the UK. Life expectancy has not changed remarkably, though, since 1970. So this is not something new. You could say this is still a bit of a Soviet hangover. Leading cause of death are preventable diseases, just as they are here. Russians tend to die of heart disease. They just do it earlier. And they do it earlier partly because of these very bad habits. But again, the government is not incapable or incompetent administratively. It doesn't just have despotic power to suppress or repress people. It also has some administrative capacity. And so I have another project, but I use it a little bit in this book on how they've gotten control of smoking. I'm going to give you vodka's harder, but even there they've made some progress. But with smoking, they were the heaviest smokers in the world. Actually, they were very close to Greece, and this is per capita. The Chinese overall, in terms of the number of cigarettes, yes, they smoke more, but there are more people. But it was 60% of men smoking a pack or more a day in 2007, 2008, and 21% of women. And the problematic thing was 21% of women, it was going up, whereas in the rest of the world, it's going down. So what has happened now, actually, after a reform that was instituted in about 2011, now we're out to 2019, is that it's now about 48% of men report themselves to be smoking a pack a day, and women are down back into the teens. So again, the numbers are getting better. And this was quite a conscious policy I'm happy to talk about. You can't shoot smokers. That's the nice thing about looking at it, right? Looking at this as a measure of administrative capacity. And there's an economic interest in the state getting control over this, because you want people not to die in the prime of life and when they're most productive. So there's a very interesting story about how they were able to actually implement this again across this huge country without terribly strong institutions. I will stop soon. Yep. Okay, here's a problem, though. And there's a whole question of, okay, Russia has recovered somewhat. How sustainable is this recovery? So the population is aging, as it is, though, in Western Europe, as it is in Japan. So this is supposed to be a pyramid, for those of you who may not have seen this before. So imagine it as a nice isosceles triangle. And so what you can see here that is that it's not. And so there aren't enough men in their, this is age down the middle. There aren't enough youngish men in this period who would have been born about 20 years ago. As we get older, we have a lot more women to men. But the important point is aging population. People are not having babies there. Yes, this is definitely a problem. A bigger problem, though, is really for the economy is a skills mix, a skills mismatch between what a modern economy needs and some of the training. So they have not moved as quickly on that as they, for longer term growth. But my argument is basically they don't worry about, under Putin at least, the longer term. They worry about till 2024. And then they sort of why Russia has been able to assert itself, even though it doesn't have the most and isn't the best at everything, and has undeniable problems in its economy, problems in terms of society and productivity. Why does it use what it has more and more aggressively over time? And so here I make an argument about the political system specifically under Putin, about the preference for internal stability and maintaining the system, and also for legitimacy. So there's, again, the argument that it's not reactive to the West, and that there were times when Russia cooperated quite nicely with us and we with them, and that there is no intrinsic reason why we are adversaries. So what changed? And here I think there's a social constraint that changed after 2012, which is that essentially they fear the street, and this is where I'll move a little faster. And you can see that Putin likes to keep his popularity rating very high. I'm pretty sure President Trump or almost anyone would kill for this. Look at this. When the economy's really rolling along, he's up near 90% approval rating. Goes down as the economy goes down, and just before the invasion of Crimea in the fall of 2013, as problems start up in Ukraine, he's at his almost lowest since people got to know him at 60%. He invades Crimea and the Donbass, and look at that, he shoots up. He's coming back down a little bit here, but it's still pretty admirable. So you can make all kinds of arguments as to why this is so, and I'm happy to do that. But what I'm interested in is the jump here. And so if we put the economy on top of that, we'd see that the economy is going down. His popularity kind of moves with the economy. The changes aren't as sharp, for sure. Here's sort of where he needs a jump, because when he's come back into power in 2012, people are not so thrilled with it, or as thrilled with it as he had hoped. And so he cracks down on civil society, opposition, media control, strengthens the security apparatus even more. And there is a new social compact that is not based on economic performance, but based on nationalism and legitimacy. And the legitimacy of the regime depends on this as well. Although he talks a lot about NATO being an existential threat, and this is part of Russia's military doctrine, it's not NATO that is the existential threat. It's Russians who are the existential threat for this regime in particular. This regime's driven largely by a desire for self-preservation, and so the behavior, I argue, abroad is really a plea to keep the economy going somewhat, find new markets, get around some of those sanctions, and also to find a new compact for legitimacy. And so here's what I will say in the end, trying to summarize, not very well, I fear, a long and kind of complicated book that's very rich in data. Russia does not have to be at parity with the US, Europe, or China on all measures to be greatly disruptive, if not a great power in traditional realist terms. The determinants of power are not just a tally of the means of power. The geographic domain and policy scope are also important aspects of power. And then finally, domestic politics determines when a state can use its various dimensions of power. Russia's domestic politics have changed after 2012 in particular. It's not your mother's Soviet Union, but it's also not Dmitry Medvedev's Russia or Yeltsin's Russia either. Under Putin, Russia has become less and less risk averse. It is much less risk averse than the Soviet regime, where there was a check on the general secretary through the Politburo, especially after Khrushchev. There are almost no institutional checks on his aspirations, and a very small group of people making decisions in the interests of their own self-preservation. So grand strategy takes into account structure, the grand strategy of Russia, but agency, the agency of the current leadership has really pushed Putin's Russia far beyond what its traditional interests would require. A different leader would not have made the same choices regarding when and where to use power or which resources, in fact, to employ. Okay, so I'll stop there. Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So we have some time for questions and answers. As per our usual custom, we'll start with the CSAC fellows asking the first 4 or 5 questions. I'll keep a list, 1 finger to get on the queue, 2 fingers to jump in on the matter immediately at hand. And please identify yourself and your affiliation. I don't recognize everybody in the room. Why don't we go ahead and start with Lauren, and then I'll work my way down the room.
Yeah,
Okay.
So thank you. So just background, my name is Lauren. I'm at CSAC studying cyber insider threats.
Great.
So
I didn't get to talk about that.
yeah, that's what my question is centering around. So I guess I found it interesting, all this economic analysis, which I'm not super familiar with. And also, I just wanted to know, like, when you said cyber is low cost, what that is compared to. I mean, obviously, the most reasonable thing is a Kinetic strike, but it occurs to me that perhaps in the comparison for this is also like lower soft intelligence operations, and also acknowledging the fact that there is a lot of uncertainty in just what the cost would be. But yeah, I'd love your perspective.
Right. So I mean, in relative terms, comparing it to the price of a new weapon system or hard power. So it also, Russia has already a lot of people capable of doing these sorts of things. So another country, it might be higher cost, right, to train them, but for them it's lower cost. So that's all, basically.
Oh, cool.
A comparison
Yeah.
to other countries and to other systems.
I probably didn't get these all in the right order, but I have Melissa, Nandita, Deepak, Iris, Maria, Don, David, Jinru, and Alice so far. So Melissa, why don't you go ahead? Oh,
thank you so much for a super fascinating presentation. I'm a pre-doctoral fellow at CSAC. My research looks at trying to explain variations in the types of support that governments give to foreign militant groups. So Russia,
really
as well
interesting.
As Syria is right up my alley.
I didn't get to talk about that.
But so I was wondering if you could provide either a few more examples or kind of provide a little bit more detail about policy scope and geographic domain, because I think that these are 2 really compelling kind of newer characteristics of power, and the way that you define them in the presentation. I know you can't present a book particularly easily in
I brought
just
it.
a short presentation, but you had said that for policy scope, the number of issues and actor is important, in which an actor can influence, and then for geographic domain, the number of actors over which Russia has influence. And I'm wondering if it's the number or if it matters that the existing power level of the actors or the existing. So I was just wondering if you could go into a bit more detail about that. And then I also was curious if you could also provide a bit more detail about the risk-averse nature of the leader, because I think that's another really interesting contribution that your book makes, is that a lot of international relations theory kind of has eschewed examining individual leaders. But your book really highlights that, the risk-averse, how risk-averse the leader is, or how willing the leader is to exercise particular aspects of power, and directly kind of determines or could determine influence great power status. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, kind of how you think that like the risk averse nature of the leader kind of varies over time. Are there instances in which Putin was less risk averse versus more risk averse, and how you see that as kind of correlating with its ability to exert, or to establish itself as a great power? Sorry.
Okay. I'll see what I can do. So in terms of policy scope and geographic domain, so policy scope is really what areas, right? What policy areas and how weighty an actor they are in those policy areas, right? So, if you think, obviously, in terms of oil, for example, and being able to set the price of oil globally, if in fact they're able to do this or sustain this with Saudi Arabia and OPEC, then that makes them very weighty in an area with that affects a lot of different countries in terms of policy. Same with supply of liquefied natural gas, which requires a lot of infrastructure. You have to get it, then you have to liquefy it, move it through the pipelines, and then unliquefy it again. So not every country is capable of doing that and moving it around. Others are, for sure, but Russia's become increasingly important in certain parts of the world in doing that. So it's really, it's not the number. I think that's fair enough, except geographic domain is, in a sense, the number, right? How many countries it influences. But some countries are obviously more important than others. So the Middle East is a pretty important area, largely because of natural resources that are there. And also its location. So it's very difficult to get like an exact, how would you exactly consider that? But I think it begins at least to give you kind of a rough way of dividing North Korea from Russia, right? North Korea is not doing that. North Korea is very regional. And it's important in one place, in nuclear weapons, and that's not Russia. So I'm trying to sort of calibrate that way and point out that there are these different things. In terms of risk averseness, I bet you could do a really cool model, game theory, or someone's probably already done it and I just don't know, of, if a leader undertakes a risk and is successful, then might become emboldened to do another one unless there are sanctions. So you could game that all out, right? So I think that's partly what it is. I would say foreign policy is not completely reactive, but if there's not enough negative feedback, then why wouldn't you keep going, right? So they've gotten some negative feedback, but they've been able to get around it. We could do more, and Steve was talking about this earlier in terms of sanctioning Russia. The other thing too, I think though, and I'm a comparativist, I should say, so I'm really a neophyte in international relations theory, make no claim to doing something particularly innovative here, but in terms of what has happened in the political system, and so there's a chapter 7 is really what Putin has done to hollow out political institutions, and I think that when you have to consult, as even in the Soviet period, you had Brezhnev had to consult with the Politburo, that you become less risk averse, right? And so that when there is no real consultative function anymore, or institution for Putin, and over time, I think this has, by 2012, this allows him a tremendous amount of freedom of policymaking activity and decision making. Not that he runs Russia alone, but certain areas, he is the sine qua non for sure.
Maybe I'll just do a quick two-finger here, given your focus on the individual leadership, and this question of risk proneness or aversion, whether you get some leverage out of prospect theory. And,
that's a good idea.
Depending on whether you're in the domain of losses or gains in any one of these particular issue areas, you might be able to see if there's a change in the prediction, at least, of
Right,
whether
right.
Putin would be aggressive or
Right.
risk averse.
I mean, it's interesting because they're actually these are the most extensive sanctions ever on the Soviet Union or Russia. The number of sanctions and on since 2014, and yet 2015 he goes into Syria. He's invited, to be honest, right? We're not invited. He makes a big deal about that. But yeah, it's.
Nandita?
Hi, I'm Nadita Balakrishnan, a pre-doctoral fellow here. So you made the powerful point that like the most threatening thing to Putin or people are the Russians. But I was also struck by how you discussed that the internal and to a large extent the external security apparatuses in Russia have also been emboldened under him. What does civil military relations look like under Putin's Russia, and could you see a scenario in which he could be under threat?
So, David's sitting right there, and he has a much better answer for you than I will give, but I will take a stab at it, which is the Soviet military was always strongly under civilian control. I think Russians protest, but they don't military coup. I don't know if you can say that. So I don't think he's under threat from the military. I can say that relatively safely. He also, the person who appears with him very frequently is the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu. He's allowed to score goals in Putin's monthly hockey games. And we used to watch who was standing next to the leader on Lenin's tomb, and now we watch this kind of thing, right? So Shoigu is allowed to score goals. Putin's the only one who scores goals, but Shoigu did on his birthday. So he's put Shoigu there. So I think he holds the power ministries close, but I don't think so. There's no, I think there's a strong tradition of civilian control over the military, and I think he's done a lot positive, from the perspective of generals, and he's done a lot positively, right, in terms of renewing. Or refurbishing the military, updating it, bringing it glory, giving it a chance to show off. But David actually does second level diplomacy with some of the retired folks in the military. So I don't know. What's your perspective on that?
I agree with your answer.
Good answer. Yeah. So we could say more, but yeah.
Deepak?
So I'm Devak Das. I'm a pre-doctoral fellow here, and I work on nuclear weapons and nuclear force structures, in particular, acquisition of nuclear delivery systems.
And you carve a mean pumpkin, as I recall. Yes, right. Yeah, right. Yes, I know. The nuclear pumpkin. Yeah. CSAC has a traditional nuclear pumpkin every year for our
Very original borrow.
Right.
Okay. So my question is about resurrection. Resurrection, and this is more of a so I'm wondering if this is resurrection in the sense of a threat to the global order. If yes, then what are the objectives of this power projection that we're sort of talking about? And or is this just a story of internal stability, and that the markers of the internal political system have become much stronger, and hence we should perhaps in the near future expect some sort of power projection which will become a threat. So present versus future, because it seems to me that even in terms of the external power projections that you were talking about, it seems to me that a lot of these are still within the traditional spheres of influence of Russian power, which
geographically. Okay. Yeah, I can talk about different parts of the world.
Right. Yeah. So I'm just wondering about how to make better sense of resurrection as what.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, you could also make an argument that the aggression are acts of desperation as opposed to resuscitation or resurrection, right? So, in terms of present versus future, So I think that there are two things going on that are not mutually exclusive, right? And one is, and the part of the argument I presented here is that there's sort of a domestic legitimacy argument and kind of a new social compact, right? So we have to be shown to be strong and whatnot. There's also a domestic economy aspect to it, is looking for new markets. We've been shut off from different places, so let's find new places to trade. I didn't talk about Asia. I didn't talk about India, where relations are very warm. There's a lot of economic activity between Russia and India. Pardon?
We got S-400s too.
Yeah,
so.
you got S-400s too, and a lot of other weapons. You're the number one, I think actually you're the number one market. So I could have talked about that part of the world, and Venezuela, I keep on bringing up Venezuela to Harold here.
Just to clarify, she keeps pointing at me because I don't work on Venezuela.
Right, yeah. He was
Not
born
for
in
everybody.
Venezuela. Did you know that? Yeah. Fun fact, and again, here. Why is Maduro still in power in Venezuela? Remember, over the summer, he was running to the airport, we were told, by Mike Pompeo, and it was all imminently going to collapse. So what happened? Russia's there. They're there, and they said, you know what? He's staying. Why is he staying? Well, we signed a lot of contracts with his predecessor to move their oil around. I guess Venezuela has a very heavy blend of oil, and there are only certain refineries in the world that can actually handle it. And we were doing it. We have Venezuela under sanctions, and so don't do it. Guess who can do it? Russia. So they're taking it and apparently refining it, and then also building their own means of, I guess, refining that oil.
Interestingly, via their stake in Indian refineries.
Yes.
That can process the oil.
Right. Yes. So, I think they're moving further afield. There's a domestic reason for this, right? As you're being cut off from other places, you move where you can, and who will take you and where opportunities are. So I think what we should all note is that they have done this and that they're capable of doing this. So in the future, could a country that has 3% of the global economy actually be the existential threat that the joint head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff says it is? Well, he's saying it already, right? So its threat is not going to be the threat that China presents to us, which is an economic threat. Their outreach economically is to stay alive, basically. But I think that the threat is also has become, as I said, one of legitimacy. But I think over time, Putin has come to believe his own rhetoric. That he does have has come to a certain view of the world. But if you go back, he didn't always have this view of the world, right? He behaved differently before 2008. He wanted to be a partner. And after 2012, he does not want to be a partner. And so, I think that it was not inevitable that he cling to this worldview, but now this is all tied up with the legitimacy of the current regime, finding new markets, sometimes mostly for the companies that his cronies own, by the way, right? Who's building these things in other places, and also having the proceeds from that also keep the domestic economy going.
Okay, I have Iris, Maria, Don, David is the next four, and I still have more on the list, obviously.
Hi, Iris, I'm a postdoc here at CSAC. So I'm interested in the idea of 2012 as a turning point, given Putin's previous tenure in office. And I was wondering if you have any theoretical insights on why we see either the kind of muted response to the color revolutions in 04, 05, or conversely, the invasion of Georgia in 08.
Mm-hmm. Or 304, yeah, right, and then Georgia. I think a couple of things. So I wouldn't say the response to the color revolutions was muted. There was definitely deep concern, but not a willingness to really do anything at that time about it. You could say 08 was a response to the Georgian color revolution, and then it turns out after all they didn't have to worry so much about Ukraine because what happened after the color revolution in Ukraine was not so great for the Ukrainians. That happened under Medvedev as well, right? The so-called Georgian invasion. I think the effect of that, though, was a little different, which was, oh my God, our military is not in very good shape. It didn't exactly look great in Georgia, right? But it did get rid of Saakashvili eventually, so disruptive. And again, starting to win, I think, allies at home in terms of legitimacy and defending the Russian diaspora. So I think the big turning point does come in 2012 when he becomes much more aggressive, frankly, against the United States. He ends the reset. I think actually it's the Arab Spring is partly what it is about. And there are some quotes that if I looked through the manuscript here, I could read out about how he's screaming, at various conferences, do you realize what you have done and how disruptive it is? So it's, there's, I think, partly a there, but for the grace of God, go I. There are protests in 2011, just as he's announcing he's coming back. In Russia, there are, that's happening all around the Middle East as well. So don't want that contagion here. Then I also think that there's good evidence, and I think I see Michael hiding in the back of the room. There's good evidence in his book and elsewhere that Medvedev's decision to abstain at the UN over NATO's action in Libya in 2011 did not go down well with Putin. And so I think the combination of factors, he decides that, I can't count on Dima. This isn't going the way we want. And so he comes back and then is surprised by these uprisings allegedly organized by Hillary Clinton and the CIA. And there you get to a different leader maybe making a different set of choices. But this is where his worldview is, right? He assumes that spontaneous protest can't happen. It must be organized and sponsored by someone from above. And so it turns out it was us. And just as we engineered the Arab Spring too, I think. I read one article where Mike, you yourself, I think I sent it to you, you yourself started up the Arab Spring, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, remember that? Good job there, yeah.
Maria?
Maria Grinberg, TSEC postdoctoral fellow. I was very intrigued by your redefinition of power. So my question's sort of two different ways of getting at why choose the specific pathway to power as opposed to other ones. So on the one hand, a lot of the times you mentioned that a lot of what Russia is doing is not for geopolitical, strategic reasons, but for economic ones. So then the question is, if everything is about the economy, why not take the time to diversify the economy? Mm-hmm. So why not take a more conventional pathway to the traditional definitions of power that we have?
So they are trying to do that. There's in chapter 4, and Alice is right there, and she's been just tremendously helpful in editing it. And you can attest to the fact that that is a really long chapter, but it's a riveting read. 80 of the best pages you'll come across. So they're trying to do that. It takes a long time, right? So as I mentioned, there's a skills mismatch. When you think about how Stanford and Silicon Valley have this kind of symbiotic relationship and moving out, okay, well, there's nothing like that, right? They have a Russian Academy of Sciences system. They're very divorced from the needs of industry in terms of what they're training people to do. They are gradually creating new little ecosystems to support diversification of the economy, but they're definitely trying to do this. So the book goes into some detail about the areas where they think they have purchase. Putin, and this is sort of funny, you may have read or heard about this, that he thinks Russia could become a really great place to store big data. Yeah. So I don't think that's a good market for them. But yeah, I mean, they've not, managed to, and this is, I think, where the sustainability aspect goes, and so why you see them trolling around the world for areas that they are kind of strong in. They were not, in the 90s, they tried to privatize and then marketize the technologies that they had in their defense facilities. And it again, I probably defer to David on this one because I don't think, that hasn't really paid off. I can't think of any big product that's come out of that. Can you? No. Yeah, so that hasn't paid off in a way that they had hoped. So it's going to be a difficult slog, but there are some things that they actually have made steps toward in trying to diversify.
Don, then David.
Yeah, Don Emerson, A Park. I wonder if I could mess around a little bit with the connection between what I take to be your bottom line conclusion and the nature of the challenge to the United States, and then by implication, U.S. policy.
Mm-hmm.
This week, I think it would be fair to say that the discourse of impeachment features Ukraine. And
I've heard that.
The implication is that if we just send more javelins somehow, in other words, the idea is we deter Russian expansion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I understand you to be undercutting that logic to some extent, because if we really wanted to deter Putin, what we would do is acknowledge your emphasis on the domestic stability and the possibility of unrest and lowering that 90% approval rating as rapidly and as much as we can, which
Mm-hmm.
takes us back to a whole set of techniques that, are reminiscent of what we were doing during the Cold War, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a very
Mm-hmm.
different sort of situation.
Mm-hmm.
And you didn't talk about, because you did talk about a lot and didn't have time, to look at the economic dimension of possible expansion. And
Mm-hmm.
here, on the China side, which I'm more familiar with, I think there's a kind of common wisdom almost among those who watch this, that experiments such as the BRICS, right? They had a meeting in Brasilia, it was underwhelming, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the Eurasian Economic Union, which we thought might actually link up to the BRI, and then you would get a massive Eurasian. Now, that doesn't seem to it, although we don't know quite yet. There's a trade agreement, as you know, with China.
Mm-hmm.
And the SCO is dominated by Beijing.
Right.
So tell me about the implications for U.S. foreign policy of your main finding that the real focus here should be domestic, on domestic stability.
So I think that under the current regime, we'll see increasing, expansionary tendencies, trolling around for markets, trolling around for friends, trying to keep the regime in power, basically. They have a 2024 problem because Putin times out technically then. So the question is, what will happen? They're also having generational turnover. So in 2024, you'll have people turning 30, 35 years old. I just mentioned this in a section a minute ago. I see some of the students here who have had no experience under the Soviet Union, don't remember the 1990s as being a particularly bad or tumultuous time, and want to join the world and the global economy. Still love their country. So what we're seeing are increasingly young Russians starting to indicate they intend to live abroad or emigrate at some point, and very high numbers. So this is a legitimacy issue, right? And also not having a successor identified is a vulnerability. So if you there's going to be a turning point in 2024, one way or the other. Either Putin, if he continues in power, he makes a change to the Constitution. Well, people are going out on the street. He's going to have to make, they did in 2011 when he came back, and he was clearly surprised by that. This has been, by some accounts, this past summer of 2019, the summer of protest in Russia as well. They've protested a lot of different issues, right? So it's not like this is an unmobilized society and incapable of mobilizing. So either he's, in 2024, could be that if he decides to stay, make some kind of change to the Constitution, declare a state of emergency, some people think join up with Belarus, which I don't think is going to happen. That comes up like a, serpent every couple of years. Yeah, let's join up with Belarus. But then it's a new country, you see, and he can stay, right? he sort of prided himself on following the Constitution, but he can add to it, right, and create sort of a new sort of senior statesman position for himself, perhaps, or just a norm. But there's an issue there, right, in terms of vulnerability. So yeah, we want to. There's an opportunity coming up to somehow lower those approval ratings. It's going to be very hard for him, I think, to pass that kind of legitimacy and authority on to someone else. He tried with Medvedev. That didn't work very well. So who could he pass it to, right? But there is a system that he has built that his cronies and then their children are dependent on surviving and want to survive. So, you know, maybe that there's a successor that comes out of that. But definitely this is a huge vulnerability. A vulnerability China, even though she just changed the rules and to keep himself in longer, still has a succession process that, but Russia, perhaps less so than it did before, that we could count on. Russia has, you know, we know what it says in the Constitution. We've never seen this actually done without having a designated person or preferred successor come in. So I think it is. I think that's the vulnerability, and that's the problem.
Right. We don't have that much time left. So after David, I have 4 more people on the list. We'll just see how far we can go. And remember, fellows, you're going to have a chance to dinner with Catherine. So you can always ask questions then. David.
So, Catherine, the subtitle of the book is Russia and the New Global Order.
Right.
And you've talked mainly about Russia. What I'm interested in is how do you factor in changes in the global order
Right.
that are not caused by Russia? The rise of China, the financial crisis of 2008, kind of, at least some people would say, kind of reversal on globalization, the rise of populism. So these create, so at some level you're looking at Russia in a changing global order.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, how do you factor that into your analysis in terms of either opportunities for Russia, constraints on Russia, missed opportunities for Russia? How well can Russia adapt to those changes? So
Right.
You said very little about China, for example.
Yeah.
China's a huge.
Sure. Yeah. And that's just a part of the elephant I didn't get to. But obviously there's, I say a lot more later on about China. But but it is a changing global order, right? And we don't know. So maybe I should suggest an amendment to that. But I think it is presented, as you said, opportunities for Russia. So China is both a threat and an opportunity for Russia. It's a big market opportunity if they can take advantage of it. It needs a lot of resources. So far, they've had kind of mixed effect and mixed success with that. The Chinese have not proven to be the partners economically that they want, although they've tried to work together on building pipelines and oil pipelines in particular. They have done, you know, joint military exercises with China, so trying to establish a closer relationship with China in many respects. But, you know, I would easily concede, of course, that Russia's the junior partner in most of this, and they don't have an interest in tangling with China. They have an interest in trying to sell things to China and working with China where possible. They're also threatened by China, of course, because of Belt and Road. They don't quite understand what that means. But again, here's an opportunity. And one of the things that's really interesting in what they have started to do in sub-Saharan Africa in the last couple of years is they are an alternative to China in parts of sub-Saharan Africa now. And they are a different, sort of more trustworthy for some of the regimes in sub-Saharan Africa. You know, there are still a few leaders, at least, that speak Russian because they were trained in the Soviet period. They went to school there, either, you know, trained in the military. And so they provide a service that's a little different from China's as well. So I would say threat and opportunity. In terms of the rise of populism, that's an opportunity that they have taken advantage of. You can see it most boldly in Eastern Europe, but also trying to encourage it in Western Europe. And so in chapter 3, I talk about support for Marine Le Pen, for example, and Brexit, and actually giving Marine Le Pen a loan of, I think it's about $7 million, her coming and visiting in 2017 and having a meeting with Putin. So definitely trying to encourage movements like that, and also in places like Greece. So again, I think that's a little different than the Soviets. They used money in a way that the Soviets perhaps did not. Right, I think the fact that the world is also changing creates opportunities for disruption or further disruption, or to exacerbate disruption in certain parts of the world. And they've been relatively nimble in taking advantage of that. Not perfectly, of course, but.
So since the fellows will get a chance to talk to you some more, I'm going to actually give the last question to Sig, and then we'll conclude. Sig, please go ahead.
So you mentioned Putin's quote, 2002. Is that pretty much also the conclusion that you've come to? Russia is not as great as they'd like to be, but it's probably better than a lot
than
of
you
other
think.
people think. So
yes.
That's the bottom line.
Yes. Yeah.
And then the other question that I had, just very quick, when you mentioned Putin, particularly the last part, a different leader would have made.
Would have not made the
probably
same
wouldn't have
choice.
made the same choices. So I wonder if it's Putin then that influenced the system, or that brought us the system, or is the system is what brought us Putin? And so in other words, could somebody else have pretty much led Russia in a similar direction? Maybe not with all the color of what Putin has done, but perhaps in a similar direction.
So no, I don't think so. I think that there was an opportunity to, especially when Russia was growing in the early 2000s, rather than imposing what he called a dictatorship of law, which turned out to be increasingly a dictatorship, to have actually consolidated the liberalization of the 1990s. Right? So what didn't Yeltsin have that Putin had in the 2000s? Oil prices at $17 a barrel for Yeltsin. There, like get up to 117 for Putin in his first 8 years. It's a tremendous difference. What might Yeltsin have done? I mean, how might things have gone better in the 1990s if he'd had that?
How about Rogozin, though?
Well, sure, they're nutcases, Sig. I mean, yeah. I mean, that's a guy who's a nut, and you wouldn't want to take over. But he wasn't in the running, right? In 2000, Ivanov is another person like this, right? But he's not going to be in the running in 2024 either. I would argue he's too old, and Condi says he's sick, so she would know. But what I could say, what about Nemtsov? Right? He was a deputy prime minister, right? Things could have gone differently. Not that he was universally loved, not that he didn't make a ton of mistakes, but he definitely would have ruled differently. He definitely would have made different choices. What about Medvedev? Medvedev, we don't even have to conjecture. There we have someone, even under the constraint of being a protege of Vladimir Putin's, and Putin right there in the prime minister's office watching him, he makes very different decisions than Putin makes, So I would say there's no inevitability to it. We haven't even gotten to the Cold War metaphor, but I hate that too. We're not in a Cold War. Maybe a hot peace.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Stoner for an excellent talk.